C'est... Ouais. D'accord. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this working session on this International Cooperation Forum on towards a greener and more resilient international cooperation. We look very much forward to your active participation over the coming 2 hours from all of you here in the room and also all those that are joining virtually. We say hello to you as well, and we look forward to your active participation. My name is Ricardo Mena. I'm the director of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and I'm really pleased to be acting as the moderator of today's session. This session will take a deep dive into greening and future-proofing of international cooperation in the face of climate change, environmental degradation, and other hazards. The way in which international cooperation approaches in the coming years will be determinant in whether we contribute to avoiding the creation of new risk or contribute to increasing existing risk. And as we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, nothing happens in isolation. Risk is systemic in nature, and its effects cascade across sectors and geographies, further widening social inequalities and disproportionately affecting those left behind. So the session is structured around 4 slots that will be covering the topic from different angles and perspectives. We are going to start by looking at what mainstreaming is and why it is critical for greening and future-proofing international cooperation. Then we will look at mainstreaming from a development cooperative cooperation perspective, and also see what the humanitarian aid community, how they approach it in stepping up and mainstreaming efforts. Finally, we will explore how mainstreaming human rights can make climate and environmental action more effective. But before we do that, we are really glad and pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Friederike Otto, Senior Lecturer in Climate Science at the Grantham Institute of Climate Change on the Imperial College, London. Friederike has extreme weather events such as droughts, heat waves, and storms as her main research interest, and understanding whether and to what extent these are made more likely or intense due to climate change, known by experts as climate change attribution. Dr. Otto is one of the authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, 6th assessment report, the scientific basis of which was published in August 2021. And she's also an author of the IPCC's new synthesis report, which will be published in September, 2022. She is co-lead of World Weather Attribution, WWA, and international efforts to analyze and communicate the possible influence of climate change on extreme weather events. In 2021, she was recognized for her co-funding of WWA as one of the most influential world's individuals, according to the renowned Time magazine, and as one of the top 10 people who made a difference in science in 2021 by the journal Nature. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Otto, and we will listen to you very carefully.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and good morning from London. Yeah, I will give a very brief introduction into what we know and don't know about how human-induced climate change alters the likelihood and intensity of extreme weather events, and hopefully sort of setting the scene for the discussions that are to follow, what we can do about it and how we can use this knowledge to increase resilience, especially for those most vulnerable. So I would like to start with stating the obvious, I think, for most people here in the room, that climate change is not something that is happening in the future and to someone else, but we are in the middle of the era of loss and damage. So climate change has long started to affect extreme weather events, but also, of course, other important aspects of the climate system, like sea level rise, changes in seasonality, glacier melt, and all of these manifest as sort of the impacts of climate change in disasters. And at the moment, because we have very little adaptation to these losses and damages or these changes that have already happened, the losses and damages that occur are paid by those most vulnerable in our societies globally, but also in every country, because there is no insurance against losses and damages from climate change or any other way to deal with the aftermath of disasters. But it's also really important to highlight that, of course, and the climate change is increasing. So global mean temperatures are increasing because our emissions are still increasing. And so every year, the parts of disasters that are due to climate change will be larger, the damages will going to be higher, and the losses are going to be higher if we do not adapt. But it is also really important to highlight, and this is why there is this video from a really fantastic climate communicator, Climate Adam, with the bomb on my slide here, that these changes are increasing with every bit of emissions that we put in the atmosphere. With every 1/10 of a degree of temperature rise, these changes will get worse. But there is not a single point in time when we reach 1.5 degrees or 1.6 degrees or 2 degrees when suddenly everything will turn into a disaster, and before everything was fine. Climate change is not a bomb that will explode at some point. It's something that is already happening. And it will continue to happen as long as we continue to burn fossil fuels. And so I think this is really important when we especially have conversations on international fora about climate change. It's not a future problem. It's a problem of the present and of the here and now. Next slide, please. Of course, climate change doesn't affect all weather events in the same way. And every weather event, especially individual weather events, have always multiple causes. And so we cannot say that a single event has been caused exclusively by climate change or not. But climate change can increase the likelihood and intensity of an extreme weather event. And that is what the science of attribution, or of event attribution particularly, is doing, is answering the question whether and to what extent the likelihood and intensity of a particular event has been altered. And so what we ask when we do event attribution is, what is possible weather in the world we live in today? And how does that compare to possible weather in the world that might have been without climate change? And because we know very well how many greenhouse gases have been put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we can remove these from climate models and so simulate possible weather in the world without climate change very well. And also use, of course, observations of the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, where we had a climate that was 1.2 degrees cooler than it is now. And this science has been introduced about 15 years or so ago. And since the last 10 years, an increasingly large number of studies has been made. And so we finally have starting to get an overview of what does climate change actually mean today for everyone in the world, because it is through the changing likelihood and intensity of extreme events that climate change manifests. But not every event is being made more likely and more intense because of climate change. Next slide, please. Some events are, however, and it's particularly heat waves, made a lot more likely because of climate change. So for heat extremes, climate change is a real game changer. There's no heat wave happening today that has not been made more likely and more intense and longer in duration because of human-caused climate change. And so this is an example of one of the attribution studies that we have done last year with our World Weather Attribution team. And I'm sure that most of you will still remember that when in Canada, temperatures of almost 50 degrees Celsius were measured. And that is an event that would have been virtually impossible to have happen without climate change. So the likelihood of such an event to occur has changed dramatically by many, many orders of magnitude. But this is not the case for all events that happen around the world. So if you go to the next slide, please. This is an event that, especially from a humanitarian perspective, has been absolutely devastating and is still it's still not quite over. So the drought in southern Madagascar that happened over the last 2 years was an extreme event. It was a very rare event of very little rain for 2 rainy seasons that led to that led to drought and famine and food insecurity. But it's not an event that has been exacerbated by climate change. But of course, it is still an event that is has huge humanitarian consequences, and the impacts are vast because of the very high vulnerability of the population in southern Madagascar, also exacerbated by the COVID crisis. But climate change is in this case not changing the likelihood of such an event to occur. But that, of course, doesn't mean that climate change is not relevant for Madagascar, because there are other types of extremes like heat waves and also heavy rainfall events where the risks are changing. And it doesn't matter that we shouldn't reduce vulnerability and increase resilience, because even this shows that we are not even adapted in many cases to today's climate. So adaptation and increasing resilience is incredibly important, even when climate change is not a major driver of the results. And so I would like to finish by going to the next slide, which is these studies have been far and few between in the last, before the latest IPCC report before the publication of the IPCC report last year. But in this report, there are many attribution studies that have for the very first time been systematically assessed and reviewed. And so for the first time, the IPCC report now has published actually a sort of the beginning of an inventory of what does climate change mean for extremes for us today. And this is the result for heat waves, where you see in hexagons all the regions of the world, and all the red hexagons show where we have an observed increase in heat waves, and the dots under the acronyms show where we have confidence in the role of climate change in these results. And you can see that almost the whole planet is red. And this gray hexagon in Central Africa doesn't mean that there are no heat waves in Central Africa, but it does mean that we have no scientific studies that assess heat waves in Central Africa, because the IPCC only ever can assess published literature. And so if there is no literature, we have no knowledge. And this is a huge problem for all the information that is provided in the IPCC, because there is still a huge discrepancy between what we know about the global north and the global south. And I would like to finish here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Otto, for this very interesting presentation you just have given to us. And it's actually a call for urgent action as well. And I would like to follow up with a couple of questions to you. The first question relates to what can be done actually to accelerate action in climate change adaptation to better avert, minimize, and avoid losses and damage. We saw at the COP26, climate change adaptation was given really a prominent space, and there are initiatives such as the Santiago Network that will support governments in moving ahead on adaptation. But given the urgency, what can be done?
So I think what we have seen at COP is that adaptation was given a prominent place, and even loss and damage was discussed a lot. But in the final declaration, or the final Glasgow Pact, there was no financial contributions to deal with loss and damage. It was basically the can was kicked down the road to COP27, then Sharm el-Sheikh next year, to go from continuing to talk about loss and damage to actually deciding on financing loss and damage. So I think without serious financial support for the countries that particularly suffer because of the high vulnerability of losses and damages, we will not make significant progress. I think the second point is, when we talk about adaptation, it's usually talk like a techno fix, or it's talked about technical project like, oh, let's build a dam. But we have seen in lots of research, especially also in the second part of the IPCC report that has just been published in February, shows that for adaptation to actually work and for resilience to increase, the most important things to do is to invest in governance, in institutions, and in education. And of course, that's a lot harder, because it means long-term engagement, long-term planning on how to build institutions, to make institutions stronger, and to invest in education. But that is what we need to do. And this is, I think, what needs to come central stage in discussions on adaptation and loss and damage.
Great, thank you very much. And I actually have another question for you, if we may, since we still have a couple of minutes. But you know what you were saying, and from us, from the disaster risk reduction community, we see many of the aspects of climate change adaptation as the other side of the same coin of disaster risk reduction. And therefore, we are actually advocating for climate to be incorporated into disaster risk reduction strategies, but also DRR aspects to be incorporated into the national adaptation plans. And as you said, the issue at the end of the day is, where's the funding? So this is, of course, a key aspect for the international cooperation, and this is what my second question goes into. So from your climate change and attribution science perspective, what do you think are the implications for international cooperation programs, in particular with regards to making international cooperation greener and more resilient to climate change?
Well, I think it's exactly what you have already said, that we should not continue to look at climate in isolation, but climate change is ultimately an equity and justice problem, because it is those who are most vulnerable who are paying, and it's those who are least vulnerable who actually take the profits. And so we will not be solving climate change without looking at it from an intersectional point of view, reducing inequities in wherever they are. So and therefore, what we need to do in international cooperation is to not separate the problem of climate change. Of course, be aware of the scientific evidence. Where do you actually need to do something completely different from what you might have done before, for example, with heat waves, because heat waves are a huge killer and there's very little awareness of it. So that's where you really need to take the climate aspect into account. But reducing vulnerability is absolutely key, and reducing inequity.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Otto, again. We are now going to move on, and I hope that you can stay with us, because there is going to be a Q&A after the 4 slots that we are going to be entering into now, so that you can also participate in answering to our participants' questions. So now, thank you. So now we are going to move into the 4 slots that we have prepared as a continuation for this session. And we are going to explore with our international guests and across continents, actually, from the field and from the headquarters perspective, how we can head towards a greener and more resilient international cooperation. So one important thing to highlight. Throughout the session, we invite the audience, both those that are joining online as well as those here present in the room, to ask questions through Slido. You know the app, and it's right on the screen, so you can either use the QR code or try to find it on the web and enter into this session so that you can actually start putting your questions already. So let's start the first slot, which is going to look into the issue of how the development cooperation community looks at this issue. And I would like to start by turning to Roberto Jimenez. Roberto currently, hi Roberto, I can see you there. Roberto works currently as a technical advisor of the Swiss Foundation, Swiss Contact, on state relations and business environment for the SDC-funded project Rural Markets in the city of La Paz in Bolivia. So welcome, Roberto, and I invite you to make your presentation.
Thank you very much. In this intervention, I will briefly raise 3 elements. I'll start with a description of an agroecological approach for climate change adaptation practiced by indigenous populations in the Andean region of South America. Then I will describe the approach of the Inclusive Markets project implemented by Swiss Contact under this context. And finally, I will share some insights and proposals for the integration of new climate change reality into projects based in our experience. So most of you may know that potato crops originated in the Andean regions of South America. And this plant was domesticated by indigenous populations around 7,000 years ago, and is still today the main component of our diet. The cultivation of this crop and other native products such as corn, quinoa, cocoa, to mention some, represented a real revolution that allowed them to develop as a society. Perhaps because of this, the environmental approach of the Andean men is rather animistic, system where they are just part but not owners of it. So the idea that everything has a soul behind, the vision of Mother Earth, Pachamama, their ancestors being represented by surrounding mountains and so on, provides these populations with a complete different perspective of agriculture activities than the ones that sometimes we proceed to offer. So while we see climate change a relevant issue just in the past 2 or 3 decades, for this indigenous population, this is not a new phenomenon. What I mean is that they used to live in regions with low or uncertain productivity, exposed to extreme daily and seasonal temperature changes and weather conditions with drought or flood or hail or frost. What is different, however, is the perspective facing with climate challenges. To simplify, while in front of changing environmental conditions, we strive to manipulate the environment to enhance productivity, moisture, soil, and nutrients in a single variety of a product, indigenous populations accepted the changing nature of environmental and opted for a different strategy. They value diversity. So they plant selected varieties that are best suited to the given soil characteristics and to external conditions. The result of these are products different in size, in colors, and in flavor. There are still today contests in rural Andean communities that reward farmers for the cultivation of the most variety of potatoes, for example. And they did this not just for an aesthetic pleasure, but mainly because diversity means also risk reduction. Some varieties mature early, thus avoiding seasonal events such as frost. Others need less water, protecting them from drought. Others could be stored longer, and so on. They may have sacrificed yields and scale production, but on the other hand, in that way, they ensure food security and resilience. Please do not misunderstand what I state here. I am aware that such local practices have their limitations and that strategies and knowledge that we, international cooperation, NGOs, and support organizations bring is also valuable. What I want to focus indeed is in the richness of the exchange. And that's why I love the phrase of that represents this event, together, different. Therefore, I believe that for any project willing to mainstream the climate change approach, it is really important to truly understand the context they will work in order to implement actions based on it and not necessarily the other way around. So how do we do that? Dynamic context require innovative answers. First, under an inclusive approach, the objective of the Inclusive Markets project that we performed shifted from improving income to improving people's well-being in general, considering an integral perspective to their needs and vulnerabilities, not only as suppliers of products, but mainly as actors of a system. This was possible introducing a multidimensional poverty approach to diagnose all these needs. Second, the project also aimed at changing the implementation strategies, moving from direct cooperation interventions to a facilitator role, strengthening system stakeholders' functions and roles. This was achieved through an inclusive market systems development approach, and it's going now. So as a result of these two approaches, we found out, for example, that it's not only the lack of water that defines lower agricultural production, but above all, the ownership and management of water sources, their forms of use, their unequal distribution, and the power relations that define all this practice. We must act on these other themes for the solution to be holistic, not just on the production area. Finally, we also conclude that in many cases, income improvement strategies should not aim at promoting larger production volumes, but rather at product differentiation and higher added value to entry into niche markets, for example, organic production, fair trade, and so on. So what are the lessons that we learn? First, that we need a multidimensional diagnosis. We know that our actions, as my colleagues said, are not isolated, and they are interrelated with other phenomena. If we consider our target group not only as recipients of our aid, but rather as allies, real allies, we could better identify their needs, priorities, and understand their own resilience approach. So, secondly, design actions based on systems understanding. The inclusion of climate change elements should not be understood as a recipe or even less as an imposition to achieve certain objectives not perceived important by the users of our actions. Understanding this system allows us to start from the needs and incentives of the groups that we work with, which facilitates then the appropriation of the response actions. And thirdly, I'm aiming for ownership of the solutions. Related to the above, sustainability on climate change response will be achieved when changes promoted by international cooperation are effectively assumed by local actors and systems. This implies, once again, a holistic view to understand our interests, incentives, and limitations. At the end, it's a knowledge dialogue process where we celebrate our diversity and aim towards a single objective, which is to take care of our common home, the Earth. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Roberto. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation, and you have really clarified what is mainstreaming and why is it critical for greening and future-proofing international cooperation. And I'm now going to invite Jens Sedemund. Jens is the head of Environment and Development Cooperation Unit of OECD, Development Cooperation Directorate. And as you all know, the OECD has been a leading voice in supporting governments and the development cooperation community in the mainstreaming efforts. There is a climate change marker, a policy marker, and there is also a disaster risk reduction policy marker. And so OECD, of course, is a key player here. And I would like to ask Roberto to please pose your question to Jens.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, from the field, we are aware that there is a limit to the resilient practices of local agriculture systems in the face of climate change, given economic incentives, time required to develop systemic solutions, and even the need to survive for the populations we work with. So in a context of intensification of climate change, Jens, how do you think you could balance the short-term needs of population in developing countries with the long-term need for sustainable solutions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for the question, and thank you also for your contribution early on, which I think was really a great example from the reality of taking action and working at the local level. Now, I come to the question, but I think I just want to start out by saying, you know, that if we think about mainstreaming and why it is important, I think the basic starting point, and that's also what we heard in the introductory presentation, is that it is essential because mainstreaming climate and also environment and policies and approaches is essentially, for me, simply about reflecting the reality of the physical world that we live in and its planetary boundaries. And I think without integrating that into plans, policies, and actions, development will not succeed. And I think also very important to say that in essence, I see climate change, the climate agenda, very much as a development agenda, because why do we care about climate change? And it's not really because, you know, each day it's on average slightly warmer, but it's because of the devastating impacts of climate change on human societies, economies, and well-being. So in short, because of its devastating impacts on development. And basically taking actions in our fundamental self-interest. Now, I think, you know, maybe to cut to your question, and I think there's you know, it's a core question at how to resolve the challenge of, you know, taking actions in the short term that is consistent with long-term objectives and sort of what are the perceived trade-offs. I think the first important starting point is to say that you know, we know, and it's very obvious now, that in the long-term outcomes are going to be vastly better if we take action now. And I think we need to take this long-term change as a starting point and in a way work backwards from there and understand, okay, we need to get to a certain point over a certain time span, and then from there understand the changes that are necessary to be made. I think it's also very important to be realistic about the reality of short-term needs and the hierarchy of priorities. I think we had some reference earlier on the current geopolitical situation, and you just see how events can change. And basically that you need to be able to address immediate needs, starting with basically having something to eat, to drink, then security, and from there I think you have a changing or a further hierarchy of priorities. I think also for me, what's scary to recognize is that, I think there are instances in human society, human history, where you can see a constant focus on short-term priorities and an inability to find long-term solutions to lead to disaster. And for me, sort of, I always have the image of the Easter Islands in my mind, and, how it was to cut down the last trees there, basically, which clearly was something that had to be seen coming for a long time. But I think, then coming back to the question between the short-term tensions and the challenges and the fact that change is difficult, I think the important point is that if you look at the actual areas, it's important to think about this again as a process. And while there are sort of, current practices are not aligned, I don't see a fundamental conflict between short-term needs and long-term change. The transition, as everybody recognizes, it's not an abrupt change. It's not a switch from one thing to the other. It has to be quick. It has to be as quick as possible. And clearly, there's more effort needed. There's more political will needed. There are more resources needed to shift towards a sustainable pathway. But you also see more and more countries, elaborating this. And again, I think they do that on the basis of understanding where they need to go in terms of, the low emissions, net zero pathways, but also about what it means in terms of, making sure there's resilience and adaptation built into that. Now, I think the other point really, and that's the important thing to focus on, there are clearly challenges. Change is always difficult. It's disruptive. We also see that across history, but there's also a huge upside. The energy transition is going to generate extra jobs. There's going to be massive health benefits. Overall, the future is going to be fundamentally better. And I think there's also right now, you see very much how that is reflected more and more sort of in the mainstream, in the sense of, what economies value, what they expect the future to be, which I think is going to be a self-reinforcing dynamic. At least I hope so very much. If, for instance, you think about, how the valuation, and it's an often used example, how the valuation of Tesla, a company that has maybe 1% of cars produced, is as high as the valuation of the next 10 biggest car producers. But bottom line really is that, there is always a bias towards incumbent situation, towards what's there right now, and there's always an overinflation of the cost of change in terms of the perceptions. There's not enough focus on the opportunity of what that entails. And again, if you look at the opportunity and work towards that, again, fundamentally, it's much better than the other future, and it's actually the only way to achieve sustainable development. And again, we've heard that in the presentation earlier on. So I think it's, there's no one pattern solution. Individual countries obviously have different contexts and need to identify what their individual pathways are. But fundamentally, again, maybe, and to close with that, it is about achieving development as the climate changes, to slow down that climate change. But it is fundamentally about realizing the sustainable development aspirations. So absolutely not just, I think, no trade-off between them, but there's symbiotic in the sense that the one cannot be achieved without the other. Maybe I'll stop there. I'm happy to address any questions later.
Great, thank you very much, Jens. And if we may continue with this dialogue, although very shortly, because we are running out of time, but I wanted to ask you, and what you just finished saying puts a great segue to my question. If you could, in 2 minutes, tell us how international cooperation most effectively can consider climate, environmental, and disaster risk in its programs and projects. 2 minutes.
Thank you. I think first, I think the starting point is really being aware of the relevance of climate change and other environmental factors in what we do. What does it mean for supporting agriculture, supporting land use? What does it mean for water sanitation, energy transport, et cetera, et cetera? I think the second step is then to really reflect what does that mean for what development cooperation does. Are we sure that our logical frameworks, our approaches are consistent? What needs to happen in terms of climate and environmental action, and that can be very different things. And then finally, I think it's very essential to think of it from the perspective of the partners of in the developing countries, because development cooperation cannot do, and it's not the job of development cooperation to sort of do the transition itself in developing countries. That's only the country itself and the people locally who can do this and to need to own and drive the action required. And that's sort of a fundamental understanding of the development process overall, and development cooperation overall, as much as it applies to climate action. So basically, the idea is not so much for development cooperation to say, okay, everything we do within the sort of limited scope of our own activities is climate aligned. For me, it's much more important to think about supporting countries, developing countries, people in developing countries, and help enable them how to take forward the action and the change that's required to achieve sustainable development. And again, achieving that requires the reflection of the physical reality of this world, of which climate change is a fundamental part.
Great. Thank you very much, Jens. And thank you, Jens and Roberto, for your good interventions. Sorry, excuse me. So thank you. Big applause to you. And just to remind the public that Roberto and Jens are going to stay with us throughout. So I can already see that questions coming into Slido, and I remind you to continue putting those questions forward. For example, just as a heads up, there is an interesting question about what's the role of the private sector, in mainstreaming as well. Because as the Sendai framework says, disaster risk reduction can only be achieved if there is a whole of society engagement. But anyway, we may come to that later on. So thank you very much to both. And now we are going to move to the second slot, which will look at mainstreaming from a development cooperation perspective and what the challenges, opportunities, and practical tools are. And I'm going to start by inviting a presentation of a concrete tool being implemented in Bangladesh. And I have a great pleasure to introduce Zinia Rashid, Senior Program Officer for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, based at the Swiss Embassy in Bangladesh. So, Cynthia, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Hello, everyone. A very good morning to Geneva and across the globe. I am Dr. Zinia Rashid, and I'm working as the Senior Program Officer and the DRR Focal at the Embassy of Switzerland in Bangladesh. I extend my warm greetings to all of you. Next slide, please. So here is my presentation is about CEDRIC. So what is CEDRIC is about? CEDRIC is an institutional instrument of Swiss Development Cooperation, and it stands for Climate, Environment, and Disaster Risk Reduction Integration Guidance. CEDRIC has been developed to support mainstreaming climate action and DRR in its all program and project globally, from regional to country level. So CEDRIC is a very useful tool. It's a practical and handy tool for risk and impact assessment. And therefore, when we use CEDRIC, it helps to systematic review of any approach or program or project across any sectors, and it's for the humanitarian activities as well, so that we can make them more climate smart and disaster resilient. We can all access to the CEDRIC website, and as you can see, the website address is mentioned on this slide. Can we move on to the next slide, please? When you go to the CEDRIC website, we will identify there are 3 modules. The first one is the CEDRIC Lite. And CEDRIC Lite is a very quick and rapid screening procedure of any concept or project design at the beginning stage, and it helps, the Cedric Light assessment helps to decide on whether this program or concept needs to go for detailed impact and risk assessment while the project will be implemented in the field. And if the decision is a yes after Cedric Light, we have to choose any one of Cedric strategic or operational. So Cedric strategic is really for an overarching program or strategy. A very good example is when we develop a country strategy or country program strategy for any field mission office, let's say for 4 to 5 or 6 years. So that time we use the Cedric strategic, and Cedric strategic is for usually used in the very design stage, either or at the midterm review stage. Whereas the Cedric operational is absolutely used for a project or a program. And we use the Cedric operational to identify any risk exposure of the project or the interventions. And definitely we need, we then adapt, make it more climate smart and resilient by applying the Cedric operational tool. I just want to mention that the biggest strength of Cedric tool is it helps to identify the 3 major areas. One is the climate change, second is the environment, and third is the disasters. So again, when we go and analyze the risk exposure in that level, we also, Cedric also helps us to identify any potential negative impacts of our project or interventions in these 3 areas as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? So now let me give you a good example in Bangladesh. We have a project. This is one of our flagship programs. It's about the rural sanitation behavior change and market development approach we apply in this project. And it's, in short, it is called SANMARK. And this SANMARK, the cornerstones approach of SANMARK, that we identify a very rural and informal micro entrepreneurs in sanitation business who produce the latrine components, and we give them the training. So the training is twofold. One is their technical knowledge improving for how to build the quality latrine components at one side, and the other way of the training is also to build to increase their business skills so that they can go and expand their market in their rural clientele and other stakeholders. So in this project, we recently have applied a Cedric operational tool. Next slide, please. So we selected one of the project locations, which is called Satkhira. And as you can see in the rightmost corner, the Bangladesh map, the location of Satkhira district. It's a coastal district, of course, and the last part of southwest part of Bangladesh, and very close to Sundarban, the largest mangrove. And because of its coastal context, it is highly exposed to the natural disasters, cyclone, and it hits twice in a year at least. And also because of the many connecting river channels to the Bay of Bengal, salinization or intrusion of the saline water is the biggest environmental issue of the community. And also the salinity is increasing because of the increasing aquaculture by private and different business initiatives. So eventually it is actually making vulnerable the whole environment because of the increasing salinity in that area. Next slide, please. This is a very short, quick glimpse of the socio-economic pattern of the Satkhira coastal community. As you can see in the left side, that the tiny small houses, because they really want to overcome the cyclone effect to their lives and asset damage. So houses are like that. You can see in the middle top that they have the fishing net. So, you know, the boat fishing is the limited livelihoods option over there. And you can also see the very subsistence livelihood options in the community. Can we move on to the next slide, please? as I said, we did a 3-day CEDRIC operational tool workshop for Sanmark project. And what we did in the day one, so day one is really about involving all the stakeholders, project partners, relevant project staff, and we talk about the CEDRIC tool. So what is the CEDRIC tool is about, what is the methodology of using CEDRIC, and how the Sanmark project is really relevant to apply this tool, and what is the objective, and what would be our expectation out of this whole application. There are also, in the day one, we also invited government relevant department like environment department, like public health engineering department. So we all discussed together and learned the CEDRIC tool from its start, and then the following procedure that we will follow during the workshop. Next slide, please. So on the following day, we really went for an in-depth context assessment, and for that we went to the field with the exact locality, and we have seen what is the risk exposure level of the community and the business people in sanitation area, that how they are affected by that. And we met with the different people, community people, household. We learned their existing sanitation practices and hygiene behavior. As you can see in the left and middle bottom as well, that we also met with the sanitation producer or latrine producers production site, and we have seen, we talked to them, and we learned how they are impacted negatively, their business is impacted because of the increasing disaster events and environmental degradation like salinity over there. Next slide, please. So on the day third, what we did, we again come back to the house with all our learning and findings. We talk, we discuss, and then we gathered all the information with the whole stakeholder and the partner project staff all together. And then we started applying the information directly to the CEDRIC website in the operational tool. Next slide, please. So we, in this process, applying CEDRIC, we have identified concrete series of mitigation measures or way forward plan to make the sanitation market project more climate smart and disaster resilient. Let me give you just one example in this plenary, that what was a major risk hazard like environmental hazard salinization, and how did we proceed as a way forward process. So we first identified the consequences out of this salinization, and we identified in the sanitation business of that community, there are 3 major consequences. The first is the reduced quality of the latrine components, and for salinity, high content of the saline in the water, and the latrine producers using that water, and therefore their products become less durable, becomes fragile in a simple way, and eventually it increases the lack of trust at the consumer or the user level, it is household or other community people. And in terms of the business, the latrine producers face the reduced revenue to his businesses because all the markets really goes down because of these issues. So what would be the way forward or mitigation measures that we came out through applying the CEDRIC tool? So one is the freshwater conservation. We thought that through rainwater harvesting, promoting that kind of behavior at the latrine production center can be helpful for the latrine producer to minimize that. Also some anti-saline chemical ingredient they can utilize because they can in that way they can increase the durability of the latrine pit and the rings they produce within their production site. And of course the mass awareness creation across the business people, latrine producers, and everyone how to deal with this salinization can help them. In addition, we also thought in parallel that our latrine producers training module, we can customize it for the coastal community particularly, and we can provide some on-job coaching like training to those latrine producers who are seriously impacted in that region. And another parallel intervention we can also do, what is the promotion of the low-cost water reservoir technology in Sanmark S. So this is just an example I am giving. We have a series of mitigation measures by applying the CEDRIC tool in the project. Next slide, please. So at the end, using the information directly into the CEDRIC tool, we finalized the CEDRIC report. As you can see in the left side, this is the CEDRIC operational report for the sanitation market project of Bangladesh, and all the participants afterwards received the acknowledgement or certificate for their participation, understanding the CEDRIC, and all the participants, including all of us, we carried the spirit, our commitments that we will increase the outcome of Sandmark project by building the strengthened resilience of the community, and so that they can cope up with the climate change issues, and also can avoid the risk, minimize the risk to the disasters. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. As my closing remark, I would say that CEDRIC is a real open source for anyone in the development field. We can always get access to this website. We can utilize this tool, and this is for all of us. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your kind attention. Over.
Thank you. Good applause for Sinia. Thank you very much, Sinia, for your presentation. Quite interesting, and I'm actually now very much interested in learning a bit more about the CEDRIC tool that you have just presented to us. But let me invite my friend and colleague, Niels Holm Nielsen, Practice Manager of the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery from the World Bank. Hi, Niels. Early hours in Washington. Thanks for joining. I'm sure that Sinia has a question for Niels, so I let you start the dialogue.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, again. And yes, this is a pleasure to talk to World Bank here. And I have definitely two questions. First question would be for World Bank, how World Bank is mainstreaming DRR, climate change and environment in their program design. And the second question would be how World Bank taking up these issues with the partner governments in terms of the policy advocacy in the respective country. Thank you so much. Looking forward.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thanks, Sinia, and good morning, everyone. Well, these are rather big questions. I'll try to see if I can do a rather short answer. And then, of course, we can go much deeper into any angle of it. But first off, I think it's important to stress, certainly with my institutional hat on, that the World Bank Group is, I believe, the world's largest financier of climate action in low and lower middle-income countries. And we committed last year only $26 billion on climate action, accounting for maybe over half of the multilateral climate finance to this group of countries. And in fact, over 2/3 of adaptation financing. So we have a strong focus on climate adaptation in our work, generally speaking, and currently we have a rather large footprint on what gets financed with at least multilateral development financing. Our main tool has been our Climate Change Action Plan, and last year we launched a new, updated version of our Climate Change Action Plan, where we're trying to shift our focus from investing in green and climate-friendly projects to greening entire economies. This, I would personally think, is a rather lofty goal. It's certainly not easy, but it does stress to, I think, all our partners in the world how important we believe the climate question is for development. It's central to development. One, I believe, key component to how the World Bank Group's adaptation efforts have been developed and rolled out over the last several years is reducing disaster risk from natural hazards. As was also mentioned earlier, some of the specific events do increasingly relate to the changing climate. And in this regard, we understand by now, I think all of us in this conversation understand by now, that it takes additional knowledge and sometimes new approaches to mainstream disaster risk reduction and climate change into what one might call traditional development approaches. And for this purpose, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, also called the GFDRR, which is a facility that I now manage within the World Bank Group, has since its inception some 15 years ago helped shape how the World Bank Group works and finances climate resilience through such knowledge creation. And we focus, or we try to organize our focus around 5 support areas, if you will: risk reduction, risk identification, disaster preparedness, financial protection and preparedness, and resilient reconstruction. So these are relatively high-level titles of subject areas where there is a stream of knowledge and know-how and methods that can be rolled out in the context of development financing. And the work we have been supporting over these years within the World Bank Group as an institution on mainstreaming disaster risk management has prepared, I believe, some countries that we have been supporting, as well as the World Bank Group itself, to better respond when disaster strikes or a crisis happens. No? And that we have seen recently, quite specifically in the context of the pandemic. A lot of this work was actually not developed for the pandemic, thinking about the pandemic, but a lot of the work and the institutional support that we've done, for instance, through what we call policy lending prior to COVID, turned out to be useful for some of those countries now having to deal with COVID, something that many of the countries we work with had not prepared much for. So the capacity to handle shocks from an institutional point of view turns out to be useful also for shocks that it was not originally intended for. This, of course, includes the financing side of our contingent work, where we have worked over the years to develop instruments that allow us to provide quicker dispersing budget support, which allows government to get a cash injection on certain circumstances, rather than waiting for institutions like us to be able to prepare and then disperse after the action. One example of some of this more institutional work that I could give is from our work in Vietnam, where we're currently supporting the government's efforts to develop climate smart coastal areas by integrating disaster and climate risk considerations into relevant policies, plans, and investments. And as part of this engagement, we're supporting 2 key studies that are providing guidance and recommendations for implementing coastal setback lines or buffers, if you will. And these studies will inform, we hope, and we're working with the government on a new overarching framework that is that's built around spatial analysis and spatial planning for the coastal areas. Maybe quickly to go to your second question, I think how we are taking up these issues with partner governments in terms of policy advocacy. I touch a little bit on policy, no? But as a mechanism, it's through a combination of technical assistance and financing, which I've also tried to lay out. GFDRR provides the technical assistance opportunity in the context of the World Bank financing. And often what we're seeing is that the upstream engagements in the form of technical assistance can range from relatively complex technical work, for instance, around risk assessment, or complex institutional work around policy advice in disaster risk management on climate change adaptation, practically at all levels. And for instance, covering land use planning, as in the case of Vietnam, building codes, public health system, social protection system. And the technical advice, when combined with the lending, creates the opportunity to provide the financial incentive structure, but also the financial ability to act on the advice. No? And I think most of us would have had the experience over time that sometimes the advice we provide seems to not go anywhere, which is frustrating and to some extent a waste of advice, or a waste of resources putting into giving the advice. But when we can figure out to combine the two, where we are advising specific decisions that are made by The beneficiary, in our case, often the beneficiary directly is the government and their decisions. And when we can combine that with the financing, we are seeing that it can have a higher impact. And one quick example before I pass it back to you is from Bangladesh, where you're sitting, no? Where some work that we supported with technical assistance and advice back in 2007, following Cyclone Sidr, helped the government take a new, for them, approach back then that focused on longer-term resource commitments, capacity, and planning to strengthen the government's efforts to reduce disaster risk. And if measured by the amount of investment resources that today are prioritized for that topic, just from us as one institution among many in Bangladesh, today the World Bank has about $1.3 billion in IDA resources committed in Bangladesh alone related to climate change and disaster risk management. And that's a very big change in development finance in terms since where we were back in 2007. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Great, great. Thank you very much, Niels, for that thorough response to Senia's questions. And to continue this dialogue, also asking you to be quite short, if possible, in 2 minutes, to share with us the challenges that, you know, based on your experience, have been faced in all the tension that exists between the different countries' priorities, and how the international cooperation can ensure the synergies between climate and disaster risk and all the other areas of, let's say, demand, like, you know, job creation, education, good governance, etc. In 2 minutes.
That's a great one. For 2 minutes. Thanks, Ricardo. Look, I think the main challenge we face from a sort of a functional point of view in my line of work is, in essence, it's a double knowledge transfer challenge, I would say. The mechanics of many development financing setups is that we have a beneficiary counterpart on one side, often a government in the multilateral space, and then we have a development professional representing a financing institution on the other side. So, for instance, and often their specialization matches, no? So you will have the transport engineer from the World Bank talking to the transport engineer from the Ministry of Transport in one of the countries where we're operating about the priorities of that country to improve elements of their transport system. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, typical development engagement. And then the challenges we're facing when it comes to mainstreaming climate change and DRR in this context is to transfer enough knowledge to both sides of this equation that enables them first to understand and believe in the benefit in doing things slightly differently than what they may have been used to do. That's in essence the delta. No? We're not thinking disaster risk reduction separate from development. We're thinking it as a part of development. So it's not that there's no need to continue to improve transport systems in country X. But in that context, can we enable both sides of the equation to think about the value of doing that in the context of what they set out to do? And then second, can we enable them to do it if they decide to do it? So I think in a nutshell, that's how this challenge functions, and that's the equation we're trying to influence with the knowledge and capacity that we can provide, for instance, from the GFDRR. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Niels. And indeed, it's the issue of how to avoid the creation of new risk and reduce existing risk across sectors and breaking silos. I mean, it's a tough question and one that we need to find ways of going around and in an effective way. But thank you very much to both of you, Niels and Senia. So a big applause to them. And remember questions and the Slido so that you can put questions to Niels and Senia as well. They are going to be also with us throughout the session. So let me quickly move into the following segment, which actually brings us to how the humanitarian aid community is stepping up mainstreaming efforts. So we have heard how actors from the development cooperation are doing mainstreaming, and now it's time to turn to our humanitarian sector colleagues, how they are addressing this. And this is very important because also ourselves in the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we are working very closely with the humanitarian communities to mainstream DRR in the humanitarian program cycle. So I look forward to listening to what our invited speakers will have to share with us on this one. And I also see that Maher is already with us. So Maher, welcome. Maher Maimoun is the energy specialist working at the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency in Amman, Jordan. So, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Hello, everybody. This is Maher Maimoun from UNHCR Jordan. In this presentation, I will take you in a quick overview on the green projects supported by international cooperation from the field. So I will start with the positive vibes for the energy. More than 2/3 of the energy needs in refugee camps in Jordan are coming from solar energy. The case in Jordan is quite unique, as in many other refugee camps around the world. Access to energy is little to none, while in Jordan, refugees were fortunate to have a larger donor community that supported access to renewable energy. So big thank you to the international corporation for this generous support. So I will start with a little bit about the context and about the background of the camps and how the energy needs growth and the solar energy and the greener project started. UNHCR registered number of refugees in Jordan is about 670,000 refugees. Out of this number, there is about 120,000 refugees located in both big camps, Zaatari and Azraq camp refugee camps. A big influx of refugees were placed at Zaatari camp, which was opening at 2012, and later more influx of refugees in 2014 joined Azraq camp. So this with great thanks to the local authorities and the donor community that helped to build these two camps in a very fast speed. So I will go to the next slide and talk about the first and the biggest camp. It's one of the biggest camps in the world. It's Zaatari camp. This camp was established, as we mentioned, in 2012 with an area of 8.7 kilometers squared. The camp has almost 12 districts with a population that exceeds the 80,000 refugees. This is a small community. It's like a village. It has markets, educational facilities, health facilities, and all the primary needs. And electricity is provided to 100% of the shelters there. We'll move to the second camp that we mentioned before, which is called Azraq camp. This is the second camp in Jordan. And this camp was established at a later stage after Zaatari in 2014. It has a smaller population of 44,000 refugees. It has a bigger area, which is 17.8 kilometers squared. And the camp has all the primary facilities of education and health facilities. And also 100% of the shelters have electricity. So when we talk about 100% have electricity, all the basic needs are given. I'll go to the next slide to say that now we'll go into a deeper analysis of the energy case. We'll move closer. What was the role of international cooperation in mainstreaming and supporting the green initiatives and projects for the refugees in Jordan? So let's move to next slide, please. Perfect. So definitely, there is a big role of supporting the refugees, as we mentioned. The focus here will be the green impact and the projects that were implemented and the impact on the livelihood and the carbon footprint in the camps. Because sometimes when we talk about the camps, and that will make a depletion and pressure on the country resources. However, UNHCR and the international cooperation is focusing to reduce the impact of the refugee camps and be part of greening the nation wherever we are. So I will start with the first project. The first project is the Zaatari solar plant or the solar farm. It covers almost 70% up to 80% of the energy needs of the camp. We mentioned that the camp was established in 2012. It faced a growing influx of new refugees and new population and a big growth in the energy needs. In the beginning, one of the speakers mentioned that there is definitely an impact on the climate change. Unfortunately, during the past 2 years, here in Jordan, we faced a lot of cold waves, especially in winter, and heat waves in summer. We reached extreme temperatures, so the loads of the electric heaters is increasing sometimes to double to the previous year. This caused a big jump in the consumption of the energy needs. So what we are doing, we're trying to green, to make insulation, to make initiatives, and to develop furthermore the shelters in order to withstand the climate change that we are passing in. Electrification hours at Zaatari used to be 7 hours. After this solar plant, and to be also specific, this is the largest solar plant in the world, located at a refugee camp run by UNHCR. There is one other important point to mention, that this project was built within 6 months, and 38% of the staff were refugees. So we focus that even the refugees are part of the solution, are also part of greening the refugee camp. The plant was financed by KfW with funds from the German federal government with an amount that reached 15 million euros. This is a solar plant at Zaatari camp. We'll go to the next slide and talk about a similar case, which is a big solar plant that has 3 phases and covers almost 2/3 of the energy needs at Azraq camp. So that one was also donated and funded by IKEA Foundation. And the plant covers, as we mentioned, 2/3 with a big amount of carbon reduction, 6,300 tons per year, and 16,000 solar modules that were built at that time. Almost 200 refugees were also involved in the construction of this huge plant. Now, we mentioned the solar projects at both camps. However, we have to focus on the impact. On the next slide, we talk about the 5 major or essential impacts that these solar projects help the refugees and the humanitarian sector in Jordan. So refugees, as we mentioned, were part of greening the nation and greening the camp, and it also was a part of reducing the carbon emissions in these camps. Second, a direct benefit to the refugees, that there was an improvement in trade and commerce activities. Why? Because jumping from 7 hours up to 10 hours or sometimes 14 hours for shelters and market, this means electricity even at night. So they exceeded, or they increased the number of commerce hours in the camp, and definitely created a better economy for the camps and the community around it. Another benefit was education. During COVID, there was e-learning. Without good number of electricity supply, this could not happen. So we are happy that even after the solar plant and during COVID, refugees were able to study remotely and even to do their homeworks in the evening hours. So this was one of the main success points. Another point, which is improved security. Electricity at night means lights in the streets and in the shelters. So this was also another critical point that was helped by the solar plant. And finally, we have to say that refugees were part of the building of the solar plants and even the maintenance and operation. So this was like a green capacity building, and we were part of creating green jobs to the refugees. So I conclude this slide by saying that electricity allows the refugees to lead better lives.
Great.
I just mentioned, sorry, but maybe there is one more slides or more than one, which is focusing on the water sector. Water sector, when we talk about green initiatives, it's not only water, but there are water resources, efficiency, and management. As we see in the next slide, Jordan is the second most water scarce country in the world. But there is a local and global attention given to the refugees and the water sector in Jordan to find an innovative solution for water harvesting, efficiency, and management. Even though 99.6% of the refugees report having access to water through the camp network. A lot of projects has been given through water funded projects. One of them on the next slide, as we see, it was funded by Bath University for hydroponics in the camps, also for water harvesting by Oxfam. We finished the part for the camps. Maybe I have to go for a big, also projects implemented in the urban areas, not only for the camps. There are more than 500,000 registered refugees living in the urban areas, and the projects that were implemented in these areas. The first project, as we can see on the following slide, it was donated by IKEA Foundation, at which they donated the implementation of solar water heaters for houses rented by refugees. They give the property or the ownership of these solar systems to the landlord and deal with them in case this system was installed to reduce the rent on the refugees. So these also gave reduced electricity bills because refugees get benefit of the solar water heaters, and they get a reduced rent also for the house. Another project was given for the schools. It was also donated by IKEA Foundation to make rehabilitation, installation of solar systems, air conditioning, and also thermal insulation for the schools. The number of schools were almost 22 schools. Also, when we go to UNHCR offices, we cannot also work on such projects on the urban areas and also for the camps unless we are green. So we are working on several projects like solarization, electrification of 50% of the fleet, working on hydroponics, recycling, water harvesting, and a lot of other energy projects such as lighting and smart air conditioning. I will conclude my presentation to mention that today, it's 1st of April, it's the first day the residential electric tariff reform will take place in Jordan. This will provide subsidized tariff for the national citizens only. But the government generously said that 35% of the most vulnerable families of refugees will be also covered by this subsidy. So implementing environmental measures may require high upfront capital cost, but will be paid back in the short to medium term. So it's always useful to analyze such options and opportunities from all perspectives, economical, environmental, and most importantly, on the humanitarian side and the livelihood of refugees. So I would like to thank you, and over from my side. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Maher. Thank you for this interesting presentation and really great examples of how to greening the humanitarian activities.
Thanks.
I now have the pleasure to invite someone who is actually with us today, Tiziana Bonson. Tiziana is the manager for climate, migration and resilience of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the IFRC. So welcome, Tiziana. And I have questions for you. So we will proceed with the dialogue. And I would like to ask you first, how did this idea of developing a climate and environment charter for humanitarian organizations emerge?
Thank you, Ricardo. Do you hear me okay? Yes, the mic is working. Thank you. Very, very pleased to be with all of you today, and a pleasure to be sharing this important panel with so many speakers that are bringing a lot of practical solutions, in fact, and you will hear from me that the charter is, in fact, about that. So let me start with maybe a little bit with the history of the Climate and Environmental Charter. It stemmed from a really growing recognition that not only within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, to which I belong, but in the broader humanitarian sector, the consequences of climate change, or the climate crisis and environmental degradation were in fact affecting our work. driving risk and increasing humanitarian needs. We heard from the keynote speaker what science is telling us, and actually the IPCC Working Group number 2 report that was released recently and focusing on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability is in reality confirming through scientific evidence what humanitarian workers have been witnessing over so many years. And this is that the climate crisis is in fact the humanitarian crisis, and it manifests itself through more disasters, more likely, more intense, more extreme, generating increasing humanitarian needs. So for us, of course, that meant having to step up our efforts, having to respond to billions of people finding themselves in situations of vulnerability. And as we also heard, the issue of equity, not everybody is impacted by the crisis in the same way. The poorest, the most marginalized, the excluded of our society, and those who have the weakest capacities to cope are the ones who are impacted the most. And so there was a wake-up call for all of us in the humanitarian sector. We pretty much asked ourselves, how are we going to keep up? You know, this is just keep increasing. And we felt that there was a need to come up with a collective step. So the idea actually originated within the context of the 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross Movement, where ICRC, IFRC, and a group of Red Cross and Red Crescent Nation societies came together and felt that it was important to express and articulate these ambitions through what then became a charter. There were 3 things that we decided to do through a pledge that we submitted at the conference. One was scaling up adaptation and resilience. This is about the work that we do with and for communities. The second was to actually take our own responsibilities and limit the carbon and environment footprint of our own programs and operations. And third, to run and lead a consultative process that in fact brought together a number of humanitarian and development actors who constituted what then became an advisory committee. And then the work of developing the charter started in 2020, and we were very proud to launch it in May 2021. Why a charter? I mean, there was really a need to not only express our commitments and ambitions, but a recognition that while on one hand, we had quite a lot of technical guidance that was being generated to help us do better, there was still a gap in the institutional commitments in terms of how we do it. You know, is there real buy-in that we need to change the way we work? The humanitarian imperative is the first one, right? But we can't continue doing things that harm the planet. Otherwise, the do no harm principle doesn't apply anymore. And so systematically integrating climate and environment considerations in everything we do, whether it's in an emergency context or more developmental type of programs, was absolutely crucial. Today, we're very happy that we have 218 organizations who have signed up to the Charter. This includes approximately 70 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, a number of local NGOs, international NGOs, UN agencies, including UNHCR. And we also have some states who have expressed support to the Charter. They're not signing the Charter because it is for humanitarian organizations. They are signing enough treaties themselves, so we're not asking them to do that as well, but they are expressing support by saying, yes, you're doing the right thing and we're here to help you. And Switzerland was the first country that did that, and it was followed by Norway, the US, and the EU, who announced their support to the Charter last week, 2 weeks ago, in Brussels during the European Humanitarian Forum. So just to end, the development of the Charter was a very important process, and signing now up to the Charter is a key step, but that's the easy part. You know, it's the first, it's the beginning of a journey. Unless we turn those commitments into measurable targets and really things that an implementation plan that is appropriate to each context and each organization, we will never see the change that we want to see.
Great, thanks so much, Tiziana. And to continue our dialogue here, I would like to ask you also, I have to put a bit of pressure on you in terms of time use. Oops. Because we are indeed running a bit late and we want to have the Q&A session. But if you can tell us very briefly, what do you see as the most promising avenues for reducing the climate environment impact of humanitarian operations?
I think I can be brief because, in fact, the other speakers have already illustrated a lot of what you're asking me, Ricardo. But maybe to just unpack this question, reducing environmental impact of our work has actually two dimensions. The first one is that we do need to reduce the contribution to climate change and therefore reduce our carbon footprint. And I'm going to mention a few examples of how to do that. And the second is actually to not damage the environment in which we operate through our operations and programs. So again, the do no harm approach, right? That is also applicable to the planet. So ensuring that what we do does not create pollution, that we look at waste management in a responsible way, that we don't contribute to deforestation, or we ignore completely how we are actually managing natural resources. This cannot happen anymore, right? It's just it cannot happen. So one way of doing this, and I think there have been some tools actually illustrated today, it's understanding the environment in which we operate and doing environmental screening. What are the risks? What do I need to take into account? There is a tool that is being used. It's called NEAT Plus, which means Nexus Environmental Assessment Tool, and it allows humanitarians to apply the right criteria to answer the right questions without having necessarily the climate or environment expertise that we don't always have in our hands. So I think there's something very practical. One way is to look at our supply chain. That's the area where we can really see concrete progress. How do we package things? Can we reduce the use of plastics? And if we have to use plastic, how do we recycle it? How do we dispose of it? How do we store? How do we transport things? So these are all critical questions that we need to ask when we manage our supplies. Procurement decisions should not be informed any longer by just the lowest price.
Exactly.
It cannot just be the only criteria any longer. And I would say, even though, of course, we all favor local procurement, and it makes sense, from an environmental and climate point of view, it is not always the right solution. So we have to think about those things as well. The IFRC and ICRC have launched what they call the Sustainable Supply Chain Alliance, and I believe UNHCR and WFP are part of that. It is really a way to bring together solutions to explore how we can make a supply chain greener. And maybe just a couple of things. We've seen it for the example in Jordan, the energy, household energy and waste management are two critical cross-cutting issues that we need to look into more closely. And they can actually generate multiple benefits. The income generation dimension that was very clearly expressed is one positive aspect of that. And maybe to end, we can truly have a positive impact by also the way we design and implement our programs. So think about sustainable livelihoods. Think about solutions that are based on nature-based solutions. How can I protect and help to restore the ecosystems in which we're operating, therefore contributing to reducing risks, as you mentioned. And all of that is really very much part of connecting to the adaptation the commitments that we have. So yeah, a lot of things coming up, but more to be done.
Yeah,
thanks.
But very encouraging, and I have to say that this DRR and humanitarian nexus is now really picking up a lot of momentum. I have to say, thanks to initiatives such as the ones that you both have presented. So I want to thank Maher and Tiziana very much, and please an applause for both of them. Thank you. And you of course will stay with us, but Cynthia, if you want to go back to your seat, you're most welcome to do that. And I'm going to move now to the last of the 4 slots that we had planned for this session. And this slot is going to look into the very important and critical dimension that we want to touch upon, which is the human rights dimension. And I would like to try to see if we can have this discussion with our 2 participants for this slot, our 2 panelists. First, Ikal Angele, who comes from Africa. Ikal is a Kenyan politician and environmental activist. founder of Friends of Lake Turkana in Kenya. She was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2012. I hope that we have indeed made the connection with Ikal possible. So Ikal is already with me. Oh, yes, I can see you, Ikal. Welcome. How are you? Great that the connection worked. So without further ado, I'm going to give you the floor, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Apologies, my connection may be a little bit bad. We can do all the practice before the actual presentation, but connection sometimes can be quite challenging. I'm taking this conversation from Turkana, which is the northwestern part of Kenya. We border Uganda to the west. We border South Sudan and Ethiopia, southern Ethiopia. It's a very dry area where we are. So when I hear discussions around disaster risk, climate change, these are lived realities that we're experiencing. As we speak, there's a lot of wind where I am, but in reality, we say that it's raining sand because there's absolutely no rain. We have not had a decent rain in 2 years. And the livestock, we are an 80% pastoralist population. So our dependence on natural resources, on water and pasture is really critical for our survival. As an organization, our work really focuses around amplifying the voices of pastoralist communities, indigenous communities within the Turkana Basin. And that's what we really focus, trying to make sure that they have a secured ecosystem, they have access to their resources, and they are part of the decision-making around what happens on their lands and territories. This is an area which has about a 74% illiteracy level and around 83% poverty level. But then again, poverty has its whole dynamics of how it is measured. Yet at the same time, this is the same region which has the highest livestock population in the country. So such a challenge in terms of what happens with the drought, especially now. As you know, one of the things we're looking at and just listening to the climate change and human rights perspective is what are the opportunities for, and just listening to all the presenters, what are the opportunities for communities like the ones where we live and work to participate in global conversations, to contribute to the whole debate of how, what decisions are made, whether in the next COP in Sharm el-Sheikh or the one that happened last year. It's just the fact that they continue to be left out, outside the conversation. And you see from the picture, the access to water, that mothers and children have to fetch water before they go to school. So their right to education is challenged because first they have to get water not only for the home, but the water that they use in school has to be fetched from a river. And most times it is not a river that is flowing, it is digging, the groundwater from the river so that they can access water. Those are some of the challenges. As I mentioned, the need to move access to water. And I remember when one of the comments that was made by Jens around from OECD around land use changes, because we're a pastoralist community, rangelands are such a key part to how we access, we are able to move around, mobility of the pastoralists. And we're seeing this challenge, affecting pastoralists with the increased urbanization, which is not, again, they are not part of the process, where there's an increase in oil extraction. So in Kenya nowadays, oil fields were found in Kenya. And now, as everyone is saying, move away from fossil fuels, we as an organization have been trying to challenge our government around what is the necessity of exploring for oil, while at the same time, we're seeing the need, the challenges for WIPO is water and mobility at a time when the conversation to shift away from fossil fuels is happening. What is the stake of the communities? However, listening to Maher around the energy, green energy in Jordan, as an organization, our work really began while challenging hydro dams in Kenya, in Ethiopia that were impacting Kenya. The Giba Dam being built in Ethiopia has huge impacts in Kenya, affecting Lake Turkana. And some of this were articulated in the World Commission on Dams a while back, and we continue to challenge, because while there's a shift towards green energy, hydro dams, we've also seen the impacts of hydro dams on local communities, from displacement. In this particular case, with the building of the Gibe 3 Dam in Ethiopia, and it's not only the Gibe 3 Dam, the Gibe 4 and Gibe 5, which are along the Omo River, have huge impacts on Lake Turkana, leading to receding of the lake, leading to a change in the ways that the aqua life exists in the lake, and huge impacts for the populations, indigenous populations who depend on the lake for their survival. So again, a big challenge around how do we address the energy needs at a time of climate crisis, while recognizing that it's got to be done in a way that also sees the impacts on local communities, because the global conversations, the need to transition, but how do we do it so that the impacts are not felt and the costs of the transition are not local? We've seen this also with the largest wind farm in Africa, the Lake Turkana wind power, huge success in terms of transition from energy transition, but at the same time, the land dispossession that is happening for pastoralists. Because this was something very interesting to see, because this was challenged in the Sami community in Norway, where they said their migration was impacted by the wind farm. Now in Kenya, we had the same challenge with local communities questioning the government's expropriation of land from communities without their consent. So again, using the principles of the ILO principles, the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, for the free, prior, informed consent that was lacking for this community. So our work really has been around how do we ensure that development that is happening, even if it is global priorities, global strategies, that they actually recognize the local positions and the local impacts, and how communities can be part of this process, so that it is development with communities, developments for communities and with communities. Otherwise, then it becomes, and that's why we are pushing for, there is no development without us. So that's some of the work that we are doing, making sure that communities are really at the core of the development process. In this whole energy development conversation, because for some reason, globally, most resources are found within indigenous populations and rural populations. So part of the work we've been doing is something called the Rights Energy Partnership that's looking at the global south, East Asia, Africa, and Latin America, to try and ensure that indigenous populations are of that development. But it's about seeking free, prior, informed consent, but it's also discussions of equity. And we've also seen the impact of climate change on equity of communities, that resources are extracted from communities, whether it is water and other natural resources, but the most that is left behind is corporate social responsibility. And how do we make sure that communities can feel that they own the development and they are part of the development? So ensuring that equity is a big part of the discussion, because if you're going to look at climate change and human rights, it really is looking at a systemic shift. And I remember when Dr. Freddie Otto said, it is not only a climate change that we're looking at a systemic change. Because when you look at the climate impacts on health.
Oh, sorry. It seems we lost Dr. Ikal. And maybe while we try to reconnect, hopefully we can reconnect, but I would like to invite to the podium to Mark Lyman, Executive Director of the Universal Rights Group. Welcome to the session, Mark. And as I said, it's a pity that we couldn't continue on with Ikal, who was bringing up a very, very important and substantive issue of, how do communities participate in this whole process, how stakeholders are engaged in the decision-making process. So my question to you, and as briefly as possible also because of time running out, what do you think, based on this recent adoption of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and human rights-based approach, strengthen climate action?
Well, thank you very much and good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I I'll break down the question into 3 parts, but I'll be very quick, as you said. Firstly, why a rights-based approach? What do existing human rights bring to the discussions we're having today about how to address climate change? Secondly, then, the right to a healthy environment, which, as you said, was recognized by the United Nations Human Rights Council here in Geneva late last year.
Mark, can you move a little bit to your right so that Ikal can...
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. And then thirdly, what does this mean for the audience today, the development agencies? So why a human rights-based approach to climate policy? Firstly, it's twofold. Firstly, human rights provides a lens through which to understand the human experience, the human impacts of climate change. We heard from the keynote speaker at the beginning. In the past, climate change was seen as a scientific phenomenon, something about environment and nature, which of course it is, but it's also a human tragedy, a human crisis. And so 10, 12 years ago, I used to be a diplomat at the Human Rights Council. We brought the first resolutions to the Human Rights Council on human rights and climate change. And really the idea was to provide a lens so people could understand the human experience of climate change, especially on vulnerable populations. And this has been said repeatedly today because key principles of human rights law are non-discrimination and equality. And so that allows us to understand this concept of climate justice. Those who have contributed least to climate change are the ones who suffer the most, and vice versa, as we already heard. The second way in which a human rights-based approach is essential for all of you is because by the application of human rights obligations and commitments, leveraging those obligations and commitments, you get better policy. You get better climate policy, you get better climate legislation, both at international level. The reason, by the way, why 1.5 degrees is in the Paris Agreement is because small island states brought a report to the COP in Paris that showed the catastrophic impacts for human rights of a 2-degree temperature rise. And that shamed countries like China and others into finally accepting 1.5 degrees. So international level, but also national level. Countries like Costa Rica, Slovenia have completely changed their climate legislation with a rights-based approach. And it works much better, again, because it focuses on those most vulnerable to climate change and doesn't mean that you as development agencies are simply lining the pockets of corrupt politicians. Right to healthy environment then. Really, it takes all of what I've just said and amplifies it. The right to a healthy environment is an incredibly powerful tool to empower individuals to protect their own environment and to stop climate change. They can do that in a number of ways, and we have one climate activist here with us. Firstly, where the right to a healthy environment exists in national constitutions, now it exists at international level, rights holders on the ground, including activists, can use it to lobby the government to improve and raise the ambition of climate legislation and climate policy. And we've seen that throughout the world. Secondly, litigation, which often governments don't like. But the right to a healthy environment is increasingly being used around the world as the central point of bringing cases from climate vulnerable individuals or groups to the courts. And there's a very high success rate. And we've seen recent cases in the Netherlands, in Germany. There was an unsuccessful case in Norway. But this is a key way in the 150 or so countries that already recognize the right to a healthy environment, where they are holding the government accountable on their climate policies and trying to get them to raise ambition. What does all this mean for you? Well, as development agencies, you really should ensure that as you are conducting climate projects, as you're working with governments in developing countries on their climate legislation, their climate policies, you really do need to insist that they take a rights-based approach, both existing traditional human rights, but also the right to a healthy environment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you very much also to Ikal. Great that you are back with us, Ikal, because we are now going to jump quickly into the Q&A session so that you can also reply to some of the questions that are coming up on the Slido. So I invite Tiziana to join us. And now we are going to have actually all the panelists with us to go over the questions that have been fed through the Slido. And I'm going to kick off with questions that have already been put on the screen. Let me try to find where the questions are. Exactly, they are in front of me. So I start perhaps with Dr. Otto and ask her, this is one of the questions that has been reiterated by the biggest number of participants. How can we promote institutional stability in fragile, failed states in order to foster climate change adaptation for the most vulnerable? This has a lot to do with your question about strengthening governance. But if you can very briefly provide an answer to this interesting question. Over to you, Dr. Otto.
Thank you very much. It's a really interesting question, and I wish I had the answer, but I honestly do not, because I'm a climate scientist, so I can provide evidence showing how, sort of, what are the different causes of disasters, where is it vulnerability, where is it physical changes in the climate. And we also have lots of scientific evidence that it is indeed institutions and governance that need to be, that are key to ensure adaptation works. But how to do that? I think that really is a question that everyone else on the panel is better equipped to answer than I am.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Otto. I'm going to jump to a question to Roberto. How do you mainstream, and now I have lost the question, so if I can get back the question on the screen, I appreciate that. So our technical team is working on bringing the questions back to me, because otherwise I cannot read the questions to you. So the question is to Roberto, how do you mainstream or upscale your experience in Bolivia? I mean, the issue of upscaling. And what, if any, is the role of government to enhance climate resilience in this field? Could you please briefly respond to that question, Roberto?
Thank you, Ricardo. Well, I believe that there are several possible actions for scaling up the experience, but indeed, the experience that I have shared, I think it's an experience that could be grown in any context, because each region has already resilience strategies there. So I believe that the first step is to assume a conceptual and operational framework for understanding these practices. Some of the speakers have already said we have to move to certain operative actions in order to propose these changes and to develop these resilience approaches. Also, I think it's important to define concrete roles for the actions linked to climate change, both in formal or non-formal stakeholders. And this depends on the reality of each context. Indeed, in the case of Bolivia, the participation of the public sector, for example, is very active. And I do not mean that because it's active, it's good enough. I mean, there is a big opportunity there to include climate change adaptation actions for this purpose. So finally, I think it's important to disseminate and to systematize the findings of the field work. This event is an example of this. I mean, many of the practices are inspired by experiences of other contexts, in a context where there is a greater means of communication. I think it's a good context in order to share these experiences. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Roberto. Now I'm going to pose this question to two of our colleagues, both Niels Holm Nielsen and Jens, because the question is a bit about, how can we ensure that the investments that are being made by development aid on adaptation financing agencies from technical solutions to actually investing in local communities and governance and institution strengthening and education. So perhaps Jens, you take it first, and then we ask also Niels to pitch in on this one.
Thank you. So I guess it's a difficult question. I mean, I think it's obviously recognized that lots of action, and particularly adaptation action has to take place at local level. I think there's estimates of around 70% of that. Now, I think there are actually ongoing discussions among our donor members at the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD on how to do this localization, and not just in the climate space, but I think the one key question is there how a donor whose relationships and whose presence in the country is very limited can effectively reach out to the local level, which involves obviously many more counterparts and sort of much more transactions. So it's a key question for me is how to go through the different levels of partners and shareholders. I think there are two aspects. One obviously aspect is working with counterparts that are actually representative of and working on the ground directly. And I think for a long time there's been a high share of development cooperation that has gone through locally based CSOs and similar organizations. Another question, I think, is to really work on the sort of multi-level governance aspect of adaptation action, because there is a way that development cooperation can try to support countries at different levels of governance to make them work better together. How sort of national, for instance, adaptation plans correspond and are based on also knowledge and input from the local level. So as I said, there's no single good answer to that, but there are different ways from working directly and finding approaches to working directly with local counterparts, to understanding how the system within the country can be supported so that it enables that taking place within the country itself.
Great, thank you very much. And I invite also Niels to comment on this one.
Yeah, so I think about 70% of World Bank financing is what we call investment financing, and all investment financing takes place somewhere. So it's present physically somewhere. And in all of that work, at least in the way we operate, we already have processes in place that involves consulting with, involving in planning local communities. So but we do a lot of work that's policy work at a national level. That policy work also would involve consultation processes. We do work that's targeted specifically to community-driven development. We finance billions of dollars in community-driven development annually at the World Bank, I believe, though it's not my specific area of competence. So there is a number of different mechanisms, and I think it's very, very important to localize adaptation actions. But saying that, there's a lot of adaptation actions that are not possible to take locally only. The link with the governance level above you is key for risk management. There's always a bigger shock that I myself cannot handle with the resources and knowledge I have, or that my community cannot handle with the resources and knowledge that my community have, or that the city cannot handle with the resources and knowledge the city has. So it is very important from a long-term perspective to enable a connection between the action that happens locally, the action that happens in a city, the action that happens at a national scale, and eventually at a global scale. And we are different institutions. So an institution like mine is probably stronger at operating at a national scale and less strong at operating sometimes at a very local scale than many NGOs, for instance. So that's why you see many different development players that have different strengths and capacities in the development system.
Great, thank you very much to you, Niels. I'm going to now address this question to Senia. How do you see the possibilities to have governmental structures becoming interested in incorporating CEDRIC, the tool that you presented, into their planning, programming capacity, strengthening, and implementation activities in Bangladesh? So over to you, Senia, very, very briefly, please.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, once again. Yes, it's a very good question. And we all know that Bangladesh, if we talk about the overall governance system, the understanding, yes, Bangladesh politically holds a good ambition and they own addressing the disaster risks or climate change issues. It's a national, not only national, but in different international forum, Bangladesh has represented this ambition, this ownership, and the genuine interest to tackle these issues. Now, coming from the CEDRIC part, I think from our, since this is our institutional instrument and our easy entry point is the CEDRIC workshop. And I think I also already mentioned that when we do the CEDRIC workshop, we actually involve not only the project people or the stakeholder, but as well as the government relevant departments, which is the easiest way to leverage to showcase the potentiality of using this tool across any actors, including national or public sector actors. And interestingly, the presentation I have made, the example in wash sector, Sanmark, there were interesting arguments, there were interesting questions from the government side in that session. So it means we actually started through CEDRIC is a kind of orientation, and it's most important that they consider those issues that yes, this is indeed from project by project, we take this government people in the relevant agencies and we talk about it. I will just conclude by saying that while developing the mitigation measures using the CEDRIC, we always develop a kind of all possible solution within the scope of the project, of course. But at the same time, we consciously give some responsibility in presence of the government people here in this country that this is probably the best, implementer or even it is a policy level things, then this could be given to the government responsibility so that they take this task into their own and apply. So this is the start, I would say, and lots of things has to be done in the near future. And we are very positive, at least here in this country. Thank you so much. Over.
Thank you very much, Sinia. And now I would like to actually ask Tiziana on the work that IFRC and its national societies are doing on prevention to disasters and climate change. How do you manage to find a good balance between all the IFRC does and the work it does in DRR and climate change? Very briefly.
Very briefly. I like to say it's not like doing something different. It's about or doing something that is aside or in addition to what we're traditionally doing. It's about actually doing things differently. So this is very much about ensuring that climate risk is understood, that is taken into account at all levels, in particular at local level. There's a lot of emphasis in our work across what we do about the importance of local actors, so ensuring that our national societies are indeed those who can engage with communities, help to understand the risks, help to plan and design accordingly, but also be the voice to those who are making policies and taking decisions. So this is really the approach we're taking. Just wanted to say that we are really scaling up immensely in this area. We are going to launch very soon what we call a case for support that brings together some 80 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies who have identified very specific interventions around livelihoods, managing ecosystems and reducing the health impact of climate change and investing in DRR. So very specific programming pillars that make sense to the work we do. And yes, it's the work for tomorrow and now.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tiziana. And to Maher, perhaps, you know, at the UN, we have a UN DRR action plan on DRR for resilience. And UNHCR is an active participant also on this plan. So if Maher, if you want to add anything on how to, you know, continue strengthening this DRR humanitarian nexus, I invite your comments in 1 minute if possible. Over to you, Maher.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ricardo. And exactly as you just mentioned, UNHCR is part of the UN also strategies, targets, and goals. However, maybe I have to focus on something very important. It's called greening, the blue, at which we're working on environmental initiatives, how to transform the blue, which is the UN logo, into a greener facilities. It's not only in the offices and even in the operations at the camps. So maybe I would like to focus on my specialty, but I'm working here as a green initiatives in Jordan. A lot of international cooperation and funding is given to climate change projects, green projects, and water projects. Maybe in the past 5 years, several pilots were done, as we mentioned, for hydroponics, for other projects such as solar, battery storage, a lot of other great initiatives. So I would like also to say again that the international cooperation was really successful for one reason, because it was not only targeting the refugees, it was targeting also the host communities. That created a replication of these success stories to be also used not for only one camp or one district, but it was also generalized for the whole camps and the villages around these camps.
Great.
So this is what I call the recipe for the success of the international cooperation. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Maher. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Now I'm going to end with Ikal and Mark on this important question. How can this human rights-based approach can concretely ensure the participation of local communities? And I go first to Iqbal.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think the way to answer that, and there's no one answer, I think it's a process, is to ensure, economic security, social security, gender security. It's a whole process, but making sure that the communities themselves are at the center of it. So the identification of what support is coming in, the planning process, the design process. So it is not only, just throwing a seed into the water. It is ensuring that it's a journey with the local community so that they own the process, because most of the development process is, and that's why we use that word beneficiaries. So it is giving to the communities rather than working with the communities. And I think, it's thinking through even the language that is used to identify and work with communities. So it's a full approach, in my opinion, to ensure a human rights approach.
Thank you, Ikal. And Mark, you're going to be closing a bit the Q&A.
Okay, no pressure. No, just to repeat what has just been said, it's important for the development agencies to realize that you're not imposing anything on governments if you insist on they respect human rights in terms of how they conduct climate policy and climate legislation, including in terms of engaging and consulting with affected population groups and local communities. These are obligations on these states that they have voluntarily signed up to when they signed and ratified the international human rights treaties. All you're doing is working with them to make sure they live up to those obligations and commitments. And as has just been said, that means through the planning, design process for mitigation projects, adaptation projects, reforestation projects, that you as development agencies really need to sit down with the governments to make sure that all of those projects respect, promote and protect the human rights of all the people in that country, especially affected populations, and otherwise you simply shouldn't sign off on those projects. Thank you.
Great, thanks Mark. And with this, we close these 4 slots, and I want to ask you for an applause to all our panelists. Thank you very much. And we are going to quickly move to the closing segment of this very interesting session. And I have to apologize because I have done a very bad work in terms of keeping with time. So we are running a bit over time now. So we are going to try to take not more than 5 more minutes so that we can close the session. But I'm going to invite all participants, online participants and those that are here, to use again the Slido to tell us in 1 sentence what is your key takeaway from this session. So if you can please start feeding your inputs into the Slido. You have the Slido QR code again on the screen or in front of you. So please do so. But while you do that and we start looking at what the feedback that we are getting, let me perhaps say that Of course, we have seen throughout this discussion on this session that mainstreaming is absolutely a key issue for international cooperation if we want to ensure that it has a positive impact on the climate, the environment, and human rights, and to ensure activities supported by international cooperation are indeed designed to foster resilience in the face of the increasing impacts of climate change and other hazards, as we have highlighted. There are increasing efforts underway to better integrate these dimensions in both development, cooperation, and humanitarian aid, and mainstreaming still often remains challenging, and we have still a long way to go. But I can see already that you are providing lots of insights into the Slido. The necessity to integrate local communities and knowledge to tackle climate change, I think it's a very important one, and to make sure that both DRR and climate change are seen as part of the development agenda is another one quite important as well. So the promising avenues for reducing the climate and environmental impact of international cooperation activities mentioned throughout this session, I think, are somehow summarized in these reflections. One that I may add also is that we have seen a number of tools, also practical tools, on how to do this, like the CEDRIC tool that was presented to us. So in sum, I think a very, very rich session that we have just had. So I'm going to now do a final wrap-up, and I have some housekeeping issues that I need to cover before we close. And I want to, of course, start by thanking all the great speakers that we have had, and all of you participating in this session, both here in present in this room as well as virtually. Secondly, I think that we are going to be able to provide you with some additional opportunities to share your thoughts on what you think has been the most impactful idea or concept or solution that you learned about today. What has inspired you? What was the aha moment? And for that, there are three options of you contributing to this and sharing this. First, there is the knowledge wall, where you can reflect and provide your thoughts about what key stakeholders should proactively start, continue, or change. Also, while you are at the knowledge wall, share what you can do, no matter how small, to create impact. Actions that we can all take to positively impact climate change and to create momentum to make a big difference. If we add all those together, then we can really promote change. The QR links are there, so you can use them to post on the screen and share your voice. We actually also have a physical wall here at the end of this room where you can post your ideas as well for those of you who are here. The second is to visit the International Cooperation Forum website and share your innovative ideas which you feel have and are contributing to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And last but not least, connect and network. For all of those of you who are here, please do the corridor talk, which is where most of the things happen in this type of events. So we invite you to network and mingle with all those that are participating in the various sessions. And with that, I'm going to really say thank you again to all of you and to all the participants, and look forward to reading your ideas and comments on these three different spaces where we have invited you to contribute to. So thank you very much. Apologies for having taken 14 times more than was slotted, but I think that it was worth it because participants and our panelists and the themes of discussion were really important. So thank you very much.